Most of the time you have a good overview of the diatonic chords in a key, you know what they are and how to play over them. That's the stuff that you're practicing every day. But when you're playing songs, then you're also coming across songs that are a little bit less obvious, that you need to think about how to deal with and figure out what to play over them. But some of those chords are actually quite common, so some of the difficult or strange chords that you're going to come across, you want to be able to recognize immediately, because if you know them in one song, then you know them in the next song that you want to check out. In this video, I'm going to go over 10 different types of those more difficult chords. Of course, some of them you probably already know, but then others might be new to you, and you want to have sort of a good understanding of how to deal with chords like this. And if you think that I left something out, then let me know about that in the comments. My name is Jens Larsen, learn jazz, make music. The first part of this video is on recognizing and dealing with secondary dominants, because they're extremely common in jazz music. So if we look at just what a dominant chord is and a dominant 5-1 progression is, because that's the strongest chord progression we have in tonal music, then in the key of C, if I have the 5 chord and then that resolves back to the 1, that's sort of the strongest progression we have. We can just hear how that's the ending of all songs. You can use this kind of pull on other chords in the key as well. We don't want to do that only on the C chord. So if I have a 2-5-1 in the key of C, that would be D minor to G7 to C major. Then I can add an extra secondary dominant, which is not the dominant of the key, but just a chord that pulls me to the D minor. And in this case, then I'm using the dominant of D minor, that's an A7. The job of the secondary dominant is just to be there as a chord that pulls us to the next chord that it resolves to. That can be pretty much any chord within the key. And probably the most common one that we know in jazz is to have the turnaround that's like 1 and then again the A7 to take us to the D minor and then G7 and then back. And this can then loop endlessly. There are 3 groups of secondary dominants that are all very common that you want to be familiar with. And that's what I'm going to cover next. In a major key, you very often come across the dominant found on the 2nd degree of the scale. So if we're in the key of C major, the 2nd degree is D. Normally you would have a D minor 7 there, that would be the usual 2nd degree. But if you're playing a song in C, you're very likely to come across a D7. Now this is a secondary dominant that's taking us to the dominant, so it's the dominant of the dominant or the 5 of 5. And the function here is you're gonna really just see it come as D7 going to G7 to C major, or D7 taking us to a cadence, so to D minor 7, G7 to C major. In a jazz standard, there are 2 places in the form where you're very likely to come across the 5 of 5, and that's just very practical to know. So if you have a song that's sort of split in 2, that would be an ABAC form, like There'll Never Be Another You, then you're likely to encounter a 5 of 5 chord in the sort of at the end of the first half, so that would be bar 13. So if we have There'll Never Be Another You, then bar 13 is F7 for 2 bars, and then a 2-5 to take us back to the second half. The other place where you're going to come across it is if you have an AABA form, and there you'll find it in the second half of the bridge. So in the second half of the B part, like in Take the A Train, where you have 2 bars of D7 and then D minor 7, G7 back to C to the last A. You can play the 5 of 5 as just a straight ahead dominant in the key that it's resolving to. So in this case, D7 is of course resolving to a G major chord. So you would really just play it as a dominant in a major key and use the G major scale on it. The other thing you could do is you can treat it as a Lydian Dominant. So in that case, you would have a sharp 11 in there, and that would be using a melodic minor on a D7. Just to give you an idea about how this sounds, here's first a 5 of 5 without a sharp 11, and then one with a sharp 11. A secondary dominant that resolves to a diatonic major chord is just treated as a dominant in that major key. So if we take again the key of C major and we have a dominant for the 4th degree, so that's F major 7, then that dominant is a C7, and when you're playing that, then you're really just thinking about it as a C7 in the key of F major. I think it's also worth pointing out that whenever you have a secondary dominant, it's very common for it to appear just as the dominant, but also just as a complete 2-5, and it's essentially the same kind of thing. It's just a cadence that's there as a secondary cadence. So instead of just having the C7, you might have G minor to C7. An example of this, if we look at There'll Never Be Another You again, then this is in E flat major, and of course the fourth degree here is A flat major, and we have a complete 2/5, so we have B flat minor to E flat 7, taking us to that A flat major 7 chord. A thing that's important to keep in mind with the way that I'm talking about the chords in this video is that I'm talking about how they act within the song. So I'm not really trying to describe all the options you have when you're soloing. So for instance, the C7 taking us to F major 7 in this previous example with the secondary dominants, this is how you would encounter it in the song. You're not likely to find a C7 altered, but that doesn't mean that you can't play it as a C7 altered when you're soloing. But there are so many options when it comes to soloing that I'm not really going to cover that. I'm just going to try to give you some information so you understand how the chord progression and how the song works. The last type of secondary dominants that we need to look at are the ones that are resolving to a minor chord, so a diatonic minor chord. And of course, you just do the same with those. You treat them as if they're the dominant in a minor key. So if we just take again C major, and I want to have a dominant for a D minor 7, then I'm going to take A7, that's the dominant of D minor 7, and I'm going to treat it as if it's an A7 in D minor, which usually means that I would be playing D harmonic minor over it. If you want to see some examples of this in songs, then you can look at the G7 that's found in bar 4 of There'll Never Be Another You, or maybe some of the dominants that are in All of Me, like the E7 leading us to A minor. Another type of dominant chord that you're going to come across that still sort of has the function of a dominant chord is a tritone substitution. Tritone substitutions, you can hear it in the name already, they are substitutions, so they're not that common in jazz standards, especially not in major, but they are a little bit more common in a minor key, and that's really just because they seem to fit a little bit better with the minor sound. They're a little bit more smooth in that context. And there you're going to find them on the 5 of 5. So if you have a C minor blues, then where you would expect to have D7 to G7, you actually have the tritone substitution of D7, which is an A flat 7, and that's taking us to the G7 instead of having the G7 there. The sound that you associate with the tritone substitution is a Lydian Dominant sound, so you're going to treat it as if it's the 4th degree in a melodic minor sound. So for our A flat 7 here, that means that you're using A flat Lydian Dominant or E flat minor melodic on it. Tritone substitutions can appear in major keys, and usually they'll just have the feeling of being borrowed from a minor key. An example of that would be the ending cadence in Loverman in the A parts. Secondary diminished chords are diminished chords that are functioning like dominant chords. So that means that if you have It Could Happen to You in E flat, then the second chord is an E diminished going to F minor 7. So the E diminished here is a secondary diminished chord, and you could replace it with a C7. That's the same kind of function. You can also hear how it sounds the same, and then that will resolve to the F minor 7. Usually when you analyze this, you would just write it as a 7 diminished in brackets, and in that way just saying that it's a secondary diminished chord and that it is working as a dominant. You find this in It Could Happen to You. You find it also in Black Orpheus or Slow Boat to China. There are a lot of places where you come across this. And very often they are also reharmonized to minor 2/5s. So if you're playing It Could Happen to You, you are likely to find either E flat to E diminished, but you can also find E flat and then a G half diminished to C7 in the second bar, taking us to that F minor 7 chord. Since the diminished chord is really functioning as a dominant and we can kind of replace it with a dominant, then that's also how you want to treat it when you solo on it. So the sound you expect to hear there is really just the sound of a C7, and you would use, in this case, the F harmonic minor scale on that C7. Subdominant chords are not what define tonal harmony. That's still just going to be the dominant tonic relationship. But at the same time, there are really some beautiful and very different subdominant colors, and that is really what makes the harmony rich in terms of sound. In this case, I'm looking at a 4 minor chord, so that's just a subdominant, but we're borrowing it from minor. And in C major, that means that we have the 4 chord is just an F major chord, and then the 4 minor would of course just be F minor. In jazz standards, usually this is played as a 4 minor 6, so in this case like a F minor 6 chord, and the scale you would use on it would be F melodic minor. An example of this could be the 4/4 minor in All of Me, where you have F6 going to F minor 6 and then back to C major. And that's also really how 4 minor is very often used. So it's a transition going from a subdominant through the minor subdominant back to the tonic, similar to just a variation instead of using a dominant all the time. The backdoor dominant is essentially just a 4 minor chord. It's very closely related to a 4 minor 6. So just to demonstrate that, I think the easiest way to do that is just to let you hear it and actually see it on the guitar. So we have the key of E flat, the 4th degree is A flat, so the 4 minor is an A flat minor 6. But if I have the backdoor dominant, that's a D flat 7. And if I play that with a 9 like this, then you can see that that's exactly the same chord as my A flat minor 6. And you can also hear that A flat to A flat minor to E flat major sounds pretty much the same as A flat to D flat 7 to E flat major. So in that case, this is still just a minor subdominant chord, and you can really play it as an A flat minor chord. And the scale you use on it is also just A flat melodic minor or D flat Lydian Dominant. A very common example of a backdoor dominant is what you find in There'll Never Be Another You, which is of course similar to what you find with It Could Happen to You or even Donna Lee. Two important major 7 chords that you're going to come across in jazz standard, especially in a major key, are the ones that are found on the flat 2 and on the flat 6. So the flat 2 is also often called a Neapolitan Subdominant, and in the key of C major, that's then a D flat major 7. So this is a minor subdominant, and you can kind of see that because if we take the chord and just look at what notes are in there, then that's D flat, F, A flat, and C. So that means it's really just an F minor subdominant minor chord with a D flat in the bass. And you can come across this chord in songs as well. If you take a song like You Stepped Out of a Dream, then the Neapolitan Subdominant is used sort of as a pivot chord in a modulation. So that's... And then in that way it's in a part of a modulation to A flat. You will also find it used very often as a suspension if you don't want to resolve back to the 1 chord. So instead of going, you can go to the Neapolitan Subdominant like this, and then maybe continue the song. For the flat 6 major 7, if we look at that in the key of C major, then that's an A flat major 7. And again, you can look at this as just being like an F minor 7 without the root, and that way that's clearly related to a subdominant minor chord. A song where you find this, you could look at Night and Day from Cole Porter, or maybe Jobim's Triste. A different family of subdominant chords are the sharp 4 subdominants, and the sharp 4 diminished is one of those that works really well to transition from a 4 chord back to a 1 chord. So if we take the key of B flat, because this is very common in rhythm changes, then we have an E flat 6, that's the 4th degree, moving up to E diminished, that's a sharp 4 diminished. And here we really just have these 2 voices moving up and then resolving to a B flat with F in the bass. Again, just moving this up. I have a few other videos where I'm talking about how to deal with this type of diminished chord, but essentially what you need to use in terms of scale sound is that it's just using the harmonic minor scale from the 3rd of the key. So in this case for B flat, that would be a D harmonic minor scale. A variation of the sharp 4 diminished subdominant chord is the flat 3 diminished chord, which is a very common way to go actually from a sharp 4 back to a 4 chord. If we're in the key of C, the most common way to see this is actually that we get the sharp 4 or the flat 3 diminished resolving back down to a D minor chord. It's still just an inversion of a sharp 4, so it's still just an inversion of an F sharp diminished, and you would use the same scale on it also. So you would still use the harmonic minor scale from the 3rd of the key, so that in this case is E harmonic minor. And how you want to analyze it, if you want to write it down as a flat 3 diminished, or if you want to write a sharp 4 diminished as an inversion, that's really up to you. You're going to end up with the same thing, but it's the same family and the same kind of sound. This is fairly common in a lot of songs. You'll find this in a song like The Song Is You, and it's also in Night and Day. As an extra thing, or maybe a bonus, I just want to cover a very common reharmonization of the sharp 4 diminished chords. And that's really because that is as common as the sharp 4 diminished chords themselves. And it's very useful to just be able to recognize what that really is. And they've also been around in jazz for a really long time. If you go back to Parker's recording of I Remember You, he's already reharmonizing the sharp 4 diminished chord to a minor 2-5. So that's really what's happening here. If you come across a sharp 4 diminished, you can very often find it reharmonized to a minor 2-5, which is kind of starting on the sharp 4. So in the case of I Remember You, if it's an F major, then the B diminished is reharmonized to B half diminished to E7. Or at least most of the time, you're going to harmonize it to a minor 2-5. You can even find examples of it where it's really just put into like a major 2-5, even though that's pretty far away from the key. Another famous example that you want to be aware of is the opening of Stella By Starlight, where we also have like an E or a B flat diminished, and that's usually harmonized as a 2-5, namely E half diminished to A7, and then going to the 2 chord to the C minor. Since the diminished chord is reharmonized to a 2-5, then you would just play it when you're improvising as a 2-5, and that means that you are just going to use the scales that will fit with that 2-5. Usually it's going to be a minor 2-5, and you'll be using harmonic minor because that's actually the same sound as what you would be using if you were just playing the diminished chord. The way that I think about chord progressions and the way that I'm analyzing the chords in this video is what I would consider functional harmony, and I find that to be a really useful tool if you want to learn how to improvise over especially jazz standards. If you want to check out a video where I'm talking more about what the advantages are and how you apply that to your improvisation, then check out this video where I'm covering sort of the difference between a modal approach and a functional approach, and talk about what you get out of working and thinking like that, because it is something that really translates into how you solo, and it is going to make it easier for you to improvise solos that really make sense over the entire song and not just something that happens to fit the chord.